Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Saigal Seatrade podcast, where we decode the undercurrents of global shipping and energy markets. I'm Trisha Mohite, Research Analyst, and I'll be your host for today's episode. Today, I'm joined by shipping expert Mr. Sandesh Ghandat. So, welcome to the episode, Sandesh.
Thank you, Trisha. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I will tell you what, this conversation couldn't be more timely.
Now, Sandesh, let's start at the heart of the storm. OPEC Plus announced an increase, post which the headlines has went completely wild. So much so that they haven't just called it a declaration of war on US shale, but also a market flood and a shock move. So I say you have been saying quite adamantly that things are not quite like that. So could you tell us what is it that we are missing here?
Well, Trisha, I'm really glad you opened with that because this is right here is the perfect example of what happens when the market noise downs out of substance. So we are witnessing one of the most misunderstood and kind of a misrepresented moves in the oil market history. And what the headlines are showing is only the surface. So what we are about to unpack today, it goes into the strategy, the seasonality, the politics, the energy security concerns, and then the broader macroeconomic ecosystem that drives every barrel that gets shipped and sold. Now, Trisha, a lot of people look at oil as just a number. Brent is here, WTI is here, but that number is the end point of a huge chain reaction of decision made in Riyadh, the decision made in Moscow, decision made in Washington, and then in Beijing, and even in New Delhi. So it reflects what tankers are doing, what refineries are planning, and then what hedge funds are anticipating, and then what politicians are trying to downplay or sometimes exaggerate for their own narratives. And if you don't understand the layers underneath that price tag, you are selling blind. So what the media and even some analysts have been pushing is this, kind of a dramatic narrative that OPEC Plus suddenly decided to pump more oil to crash prices and, then eventually they're gonna hurt American shale. But that couldn't be a farther from the truth, and this isn't just aggressive supply surge. And it is not coming out of nowhere. So let me paint a clear and clearer picture here. So OPEC Plus announced that they will increase production by 411,000 barrels per day. And that figure, it's not an injection, it's a recognition. OPEC Plus didn't just say that, okay, let's add some more barrels in the market and let's move on with that. What they said was, and what the real analysis from their production growth is that we see that some of our members, that means some of OPEC members, notably Iraq and Kazakhstan, have already producing over a quota. So rather than penalize them and risk internal dissent, let's adjust the official ceiling to reflect that reality. So this is what they have said in their recent meeting, and the main cues from that, OPEC Plus wants to contain or wants to remain their unique sentiments, and their unique sentiments is that their own unity when it comes to the production and price relativity. Now think of it like this. If you are hosting a dinner party and one of the guests shows up with a friend, so you don't kick them out halfway through, right? You just pull up an extra chair and then call it part of the plan. And that's what this is. It's an accommodation, formalization of what was already happening. And this wasn't a kind of a spontaneous either. The group, it had already announced months earlier that they were going to start rolling back 2.2 million barrels per day in a voluntary cuts over the 18 months. So this wasn't some, market shock. So this was a pre-signaled. So anyone who was actually following the group's December statement would have seen these increases coming from a mile away. Now, having said that, here is the irony. Even with these so-called increases, actual export numbers from April shows that OPEC Plus exports actually declined. So we are talking about a paper increase that doesn't even translate into a physical supply boost. And that's critical to understand because, it shows that the move is more about optics and policy than the barrels. And then there is a seasonal demand angle, which, kind of a barely anyone in the mainstream media has been picked up on. So in summer, in the Middle East, it isn't just hot, it's brutal. The climatic conditions in that particular area is way more haywire. So in summer, domestic demand for the electricity it surges, particularly for air condition. So we are looking at an extra 1.2 million barrels per day being burned just to keep household and public spaces cool. And that is just in the Middle East area. If you closely see the OPEC plus structure, the nations of the OPEC plus has been distributed widely over the globe. And we are only talking about the OPEC nations or OPEC plus nations. Those are present in the Middle East. Now, having said that, another important point that has been out of box or that has no one think of is the Hajj pilgrimage in Saudi Arabia. It drowns millions of people from around the world, and then when they are coming into the country in the Saudi Arabia, in the Makkah, you then have to think about the higher demand aviation fuel, diesel for transport, gasoline for buses, power generation for the massive infrastructure it required to support the pilgrimage, and that demand spike is real and it's a domestic. So the most of the oil that being added in theory is never even leaving the region. And I have been already said in our previous podcast, higher production doesn't necessarily mean lead to the higher exports. So this is the domestic growth or domestic increase in the consumption of crude oil. It is staying at home. It's not going to depress the global market. So if anything, it helps tighten the international supply picture because those barrels aren't available for the exports. And at the last piece of puzzle is the group's cohesion. OPEC plus is a coalition, and coalitions survive not by rigid enforcement but by flexibility and trust. So if the leadership had tried to enforce strict cuts on Iraq and Kazakhstan, as a part of the punishment, they risk splintering the group, and instead they acknowledge what was happening and adjusted the rules to fit the reality. So what tells you that this particular move, it's a strategic, it's a stabilizing, and it's completely misunderstood. So when people say that this is about a price war with US shale, just look at the data, look at the exports, look at the domestic consumption pattern, and most of all, look at the long game. This is about sustainability, not the sabotage.
Now, Sandesh, I couldn't help but notice you saying that it isn't just about oil, it's about geopolitics. And that Saudi Arabia in particular has strategic motives beyond the barrels. So, could you tell us more? What did you mean by that?
Now we are moving into the real theater of global energy politics because, previously it was about the mechanics of oil flows and quotas. And so here I want to say about stage which widens, and oil becomes not just a resource but it kind of becomes tool of influence, leverage, and even sometimes silence. So when I say Saudi Arabia is being strategic here, so what I mean is that they are kind of no longer operating in the 1970s model because of oil diplomacy. It was a kind of used as a production level, as a blunt weapon at that time. Now talking about today, their use of oil is subtle, often kind of a preemptive, and it is a deeply intertwined with their foreign policy. So think of oil as a silencer and not a megaphone, and that's what's happening right now. So let's look at the calendar. In the run up to these so-called production increases, the kingdom had an extraordinary string of high-level diplomatic engagements lined up, and this is, I want to be very apolitical. So meeting with American officials, meeting with different countries, diplomats, strategic dialogues with UAE and Qatar, then the conversation with the European counterparts about Yemen, Gaza and Sudan and more. And what's common thread among all those conversations? They are incredibly sensitive. And if oil prices had been soaring, spiking towards these or even hundreds, you can bet your last barrel that it would have been dominated the agenda. And that's the last thing Saudi Arabia wanted. So what did they do? They took oil off the table. And this is not the bold statement. We can see from the recent interviews from all the diplomats, you can analyze that oil is completely off the table, and it was not by undercutting their own interest but by managing expectations, guiding price sentiment, and yes, even allowing a little extra production on a paper. So it's a elegant, and by normalizing an increase, they kind of signal the price stability. And once you take oil volatility out of the room, those diplomats and then the negotiators, they can focus on security issues, conflict resolutions, deals, and take cooperation. That's the real play here. And it's not the first time they have done this. During the Xi Jinping's visit in Riyadh in 2022, you will notice something fascinating. So, energy was not the centerpiece of the conversation, and that wasn't by accident. That was a strategic exclusion. So, the Saudis, they didn't want oil politics mudding up deeper cooperation on tech, trade, and infrastructure. And kind of a same thing with the Prime Minister Modi's visit in early 2024. Even in this visit, oil was sidestepped. The focus was mainly on renewable tech, collaboration, AI initiatives, and military trade. So Saudi Arabia has evolved. They no longer see oil as just a commodity they export. They see it as a chess piece. They can move sometimes assertively, and then sometimes just by not moving it at all. So now bring Trump back into the mix. So his second term is kind of unfolding, and one of his cornerstone strategies is to rebuild American manufacturing and the energy independence. So the MAGA, that particular sentiment, is revolved around these two only. So what does that mean for the Saudis? So it means they need to secure their seat at the US economic table, and they are doing exactly like that. Aramco's expansion of the Motiva refinery in Texas. And when Aramco signs MOUs with the companies like Sempra and Next Decade for LNG access, it's not just about the diversifying their portfolio. It's about embedding themselves into the US energy architecture. So you cannot talk about the LNG exports from America without Saudi Arabia being in the room. That's a long-term leverage. And you know what? We haven't even touched on the $600 billion investment pledge that we have seen yesterday. And that's a massive signal to Washington. We are not just a supplier, we are a stakeholder. So when I say oil is being used by diplomatically, I mean exactly that. Not through bombast, but through orchestration, through planning, through timely silence. So they are neutralizing oil as a disruptive topic so they can have a bigger, more consequential conversation. And conversations that shape not just the energy market but the global order. A lot of people in the oil business or oil industry, they kind of assume that Trump has real significance over OPEC, and with the just one call he can ask MBS to decrease oil and decrease oil production, and kind of have a significant impact on the oil prices, because Trump's always want oil prices to be lower, and that is the something which he kind of plays even in his previous term as a president. And that's what he wants to try, that try to renegotiate the same thing with the global industry leaders. But oil is significantly absent from these talks, because when the US president is meeting with Saudi Arabian, they are not just discussing about oil. Oil is off the topic, because when the US president is getting in touch with the MBS, they discuss about the global politics, they discuss about the energy, they discuss about AI, they discuss about all those things. Then they discuss about all the topics that related to the future growth, from the Syrian perspective, future growth from the Lebanese perspective, then the ongoing war in South Sudan. So oil is just sidelined here because they don't want to mess up all those discussions with respect to oil. And the other point of view is that there are lot of important topics there, those are there, that there is utter no necessity to discuss oil at all. Oil can be only discussed when there is a price, those are reaching to the ceiling. If the price are going beyond $100, then the world leaders must have coming into the Saudi Arabia and discussing about the oil and oil prices. But that is not happening. The other important point is this: whenever a political person or diplomat is speaking about, he always have a three type of thoughts or three type of weightage. I can say one is political weightage, one is economic weightage, and one is financial weightage. So when we talk about, or whenever US president talk about the oil, he can lose all three weightage in a single conversation. So he has to protect those weightage. That's why oil is now sidelined. Oil today is not just about the flows and prices. It's about the agendas. It's about the optics. It's about what you don't say as much as what you do. And that, in my view, is one of the most sophisticated energy strategies being deployed anywhere in the world right now. Another important point is this: whenever US president, I mean in earlier terms, whenever US president is going to Saudi Arabia, they don't just lecture about how the policies has to be governed and how the world should run. But this time, this particular scenario is completely changed. Trump has been viewed as a negotiator, has been viewed as a deal maker, has been viewed as a peacemaker. So it is evident that, because we have seen yesterday, US president has, removed the sanctions on Russia, and he also said that he wants to have a positive talks with the Iran, so that the both the countries, they can play a significant important role in the global markets and specifically in the oil markets.
Now, Sandesh, there's another story bubbling beneath all of this, which is none other than the sanctions and the so called dark fleet. We see over 1,100 ships operating outside the rules. So, could you tell us what's really happening over here?
Well, Trisha, I'm so glad you brought this up, because the rise of the dark fleet is one of the most consequential and underappreciated shifts in the modern maritime logistics. And you know what? It's not just about law breaking ships, those are sneaking through the sanction. It's kind of about a parallel universe of oil trade that's grown large enough to influence the global flows. It is kind of a distorting prices and create massive systematic risk. And this isn't a subplot, it's kind of the hidden main event. So let's start with what we know on a paper. We have analyzed the data. Today there are about 72 tankers that are categorized as sanctions violators to some degree. And that's a massive number. To put in the perspective, that's nearly a fifth of the global dirty tanker fleet. Now within that group, or within that 1172 tankers, 573 tankers, those are blacklisted by the US Treasury. OPEC, the UK's FCDO has blacklisted 245, and then European Union has targeted 141. But, and here is the twist, only 34 of these ships are blacklisted by all the three. So what does that tell you? Out of 111, out of 172 ships, only 34 ships sanctioned by all three uniquely. And in percentage, that is a less than 3%. So the rest, they are operating in a regulatory twilight zone. One country's rogue is another's regular. Now what does that mean in the practice? So it means that if you are a sanctioned Iranian tanker that has been blacked by US, but you have cleverly reflagged in Panama or Tanzania, you might still be able to load crude from Russia's the eastern ports and then sell it to the buyer in India or China and kind of settle a transaction in yuan, while all dodging the global financial system. And nobody, not the banks, not the ports, not the tracking software, can easily catch you unless there is a serious coordination. And you know what? The players, those are in the place, they are kind of actually have grown in the system that they can easily avoid these trackings, because the coordination end to end is so good that you not catch one another. And when, even if you are trying to reach to the end entity, the funds are already gone in the market. But it gets even more complex because these particular ships often operate under the forged documentation. So they spoof their AIS signals, meaning that they can disappear from satellite tracking for hours and even days. And then the swap identities in the mid-ocean, conduct ship-to-ship transport in the international waters, and even carry out their business in places where enforcement is almost impossible. So the Eastern Mediterranean Sea, the South China Sea, part of the Indian Ocean, these are all hotbeds for the dark activity. So this fleet has grown not just because of poor enforcement, but because of demand exists. Countries that are under energy strain like Syria, like Venezuela's customer, like even some EU buyers, they are desperate for the discounted feedstock and have looked the other way or kind of outright participations. And because the world's regulatory bodies aren't so coordinated, the dark fleet thrives, and they are kind of a thriving now and then. But here is what things kind of a concerning. We have older ships, we have single hull vessels, we have kind of a minimal maintained, poorly crewed vessels with the flag of convenience. There is a safety risk. There is a risk of oil spill, grounding, onboard fire, pollution, and if you collectively see that, that's the global shipping crisis. And we haven't even touched on insurance. So these ships, they are either underinsured or entirely uninsured. So they don't carry proper protection and indemnity cover from any of the reputable clubs. So if something goes wrong, there is no one to foot the bill. No compensation, no cleanup funds, nothing and nothing. And this has a knock-on effect across the legitimate market because insurance, they kind of have become warier. Charters have to scrutinize vessel histories more aggressively and rates start to reflect risk premium. So even innocent actors get caught in the wash because insurers and the financier don't want to get burned. So now the legitimate trades are being priced as if they are risky because they are sailing in the same waters as the ghost tankers. And having said that, it also kind of a warps market data. If a fifth of the fleet is invisible or operating with the fake logs, then your supply estimates, your voyage durations, your port call data, all of it becomes suspect. Analysts can't trust the numbers. That makes hedging harder, that makes forecasting unreliable, and it's like trying to trade in a fog. But then what is the solution, that you might ask? The only solution to this is international cooperation. We need to harmonize the sanction list and shared databases. Then we have a AI powered tracking system that can spot identity fraud and transponder spoofing in the real time. Then we need some ports and we need shipping registries. They could talk to each other, and then we need to start holding the enablers of accountable. And those are the banks, lawyers, the insurers who look the other way because the profits are too good. So this isn't just about morality or legality anymore. It's about the market functionality. So dark fleet isn't just dodging a sanction, it's distorting the very fabric of global oil trade. And the longer we let it grow unchecked, the harder it's going to be untangle its impact from the real economy.
Now, Sandesh, zooming out again, how is the macroeconomic picture influencing all of this? Right from tariffs, currency shifts, policy volatility. I'd like to ask, is this a new era?
It absolutely is, because we are living through the fragmentation of the global economy as we knew it for the nearly 5 decades. And what's fascinating and frankly disorienting for many is that we are no longer talking about a single global system. We are watching the emergence of two distinct but overlapping ecosystems, and that I can call them as a dual energy worlds. So on one side we have a, what you might call as a one energy world. It's a dollar dominated, fossil fuel dominant, shaped up by legacy institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and a decade of US foreign policy. This is the world where Brent crude prices move markets, where the energy settlements happen in dollars, and where US interest rate hikes still ripple through the oil importing economies, and that's the familiar terrain for most traders and analysts. But now, on the other side, something new is growing, and we can call it as a new energy world. And you know what? It's yuan influenced. It's built on a solar panels, lithium batteries, electric vehicles, and wind turbines. And it's deeply intertwined with China's export driven industrial policy. And what's more, this system isn't just technological, it's a financial, it's a geopolitical, it's a industry driven. So China has spent the last decade locking in kind of a rare earth materials, expanding belt and road infrastructure, and then creating trade agreements that don't depend on the dollar at all. So and the result is, for the first time since 1970s, the energy market are kind of a bifurcating, not fully, not yet, but undeniably. So we are watching some countries, they hedge their bets. Let me give one example, that is Japan. So it is buying US LNG and crude to maintain ties with the Washington, while at the same time simultaneously investing billions into Chinese solar supply chains. India is also doing joint energy ventures with different crude and LNG suppliers over the globe. But at the same time, they are also attending the climate summit in Brussels. And then let's add the Trump's economic policy to that. So it's a volatile cocktail of tariffs and dollar devaluation, and then the interest rate pressures on the Fed. So what's it's doing, intentionally or not, is shaking the foundation of the dollar as the world's reserve currency. April 2025 was a wake-up call. The dollar fell, the treasury yields dropped, and the equity markets tumbled at the same time. And not the normal, that's the systemic stress. So why does this matter for energy and shipping? Because the way we price and move energy is directly tied to the financial system. So if the dollar is under stress, that's affect the hedging. If it affects the future markets, it impacts insurance contracts, and then it eventually impacts the shipping loans. And if the countries increasingly settle trades in yuan, you need an entirely different infrastructure to manage those flows.
Yes, we are already seeing that, Sandesh. More LNG contracts out of China are being priced in yuan, and even the Russian oil going to India is increasingly settled in rupees or UAE dirhams. And even the Chinese banks, they are also quietly expanding their reach into commodity financing. Now, that means that the old Brent Dubai spread isn't the only story anymore. Now, we are tracking alternative benchmarks, shadow flows, and off ledger financing. In the shipping routes, we see the change. Take the rerouting of the LNG cargoes, which are away from the Red Sea due to the Houthi threats. Some cargoes are now rounding the Cape of Good Hope, and that's not just a detour, it's a signal that old assumptions about the choke points like Suez and Panama, they no longer hold. And the climate change, geopolitics, and economic fragmentations are rewriting the map.
And you know what? That was the real sentiment here. So this new dual energy system will create winners and losers, Trisha. So traders who understand both sides of the coin, or who can model dollar and non-dollar flows, or who can track sanctioned and unsanctioned volumes and follow not just the vessel routes but also policy pipelines, those traders will thrive. The rest, they will kind of a blindsided. So yes, Trisha, we are in a new era. It's a messy, it's uncertain, but it's also full of opportunity. So if you are willing to unlearn some of the new old rules,